Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Where Have All the Democrats Gone by Ruy Teixeira and John B. Judis. And if I mispronounce either of those names, I do apologize. I'll talk very briefly about the authors, go into an overview of what the book's about, talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reviewing next time. Both authors are involved in the journalism and political sphere. I think one of them works for Talking Point, and the other one, I believe, has done work or is currently working for the American Enterprise Institute, which are think tanks. They co-wrote a book in the early 2000s called "The Emerging Democratic Majority," which proposed that a growing number of single women and minority groups had common interest and would ensure an ongoing Democratic majority. This essentially became the Obama coalition in 2008 when he was elected. And so they wrote this book predicting that would happen. That did happen. And they're returning together as co authors to write about what they see as the failings of the Democrats to ensure that they are able to bring working class people into the coalition, and really pointing to the failings of they start with Jimmy Carter, all the way back in Jimmy Carter, but certainly through the Clinton administration up into Obama and now to some degree Biden. And the book is really them looking at the cultural shifts of the Democratic Party. They have a term they use called the shadow party, which is to say that there are people who are activists or people who are in charge of think tanks or the intelligentsia who are pushing policies that they are seen as extreme by many, or the majority of people. And so the book is kind of two different phases to it. The first phase is really the history of the Democrats over the last, again, I'd say roughly starting with Jimmy Carter, but really mostly focused on Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden, and what they did or haven't done for working poor people. And for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to use working poor people as a synonym with anyone who, um, anytime you get to talk about class distinctions in the United States, it gets gets messy really quickly. They usually refer to that in this book as people without a college degree, and so that's what I'm going to be using. I think that in some ways is an imperfect measure, but it's the one we're going to use. There are a lot of people with college degrees who make $40,000 a year, but anyway, we'll just use that for the sake of this video, and that's largely what they use. So it's basically the Democrats who, under Roosevelt, were really the party of the working poor. Through Carter and Clinton, especially, and Obama, into Biden, the failings of the Democratic Party to hold together the coalition of the working poor and really cultivating, culminating with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 with his beating of Hillary Clinton. So that's really the first part of the book, is to look through the lens of what did each one of these presidents do for working poor people, or where did they leave working poor people behind in terms of the policies, or um, where did they emphasize their policies, who were they helping with those policies, who did they harm with the policies. And then the second half of the book is really I would say the cultural issues that are alienating a lot of these working poor people, even beyond the economics of it. And so they cover really four main topics in the second half: is really race and race relations, immigration, issues involving gender and sex. They mostly focus on transgendered stuff in that section, and then finally the environment. And they basically go to great lengths to show that the Democratic Party have shifted, compared to the average person, pretty far to the left, or yeah, I'll just say pretty far to the left. So overall, what did I like about the book? This book uh, was extremely well written in the sense that it is lean. It says what it has to say. It has examples of it, and then it gets out. It's I read it in 2 days. It's a very, very quick read. It's very, very punchy. I found it to be very, very easy to understand. I thought it made its points very cogently, and there are certainly some points where I disagreed with it. But if I was to give someone um, if someone was going to read a 300-page book for me, and they really wanted to do me a favor, or it's just something they hadn't thought about before, or didn't really understand why someone who is maybe a working poor person would want to vote for Republicans. Why would they want to do that? And I think this book is actually an excellent primer for explaining that to someone to say, here is from a working poor person's viewpoint of where the Democrats have let them down over the last 40 years. And I think this book does a really, really good job of that. Um, so I think it does do that. There wasn't anything necessarily that I hadn't read here before, but having just recently read David Leonhardt's book, um, Ours Was the Shining Future, I just thought this in comparison to that, not to like insult that book because each book is a little bit different, but I thought this book did a much, much better job of making some of the same points that he made in a much, much tighter frame, in a much, much shorter way. Um, so I appreciated that very much. I think they did a very good job of going through both the administrations of really Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. This is the second book in a row I've read that was the reexamination of the Clinton years, and really the Bill Clinton in both the bills involving financial deregulation, but also the creation of the World Trade Organization and involving China or China's entrance into the World Trade Organization, how the people who got that wrong in terms of the frankly utopian thinking about bringing China in, of what that was going to do to a lot of working poor and middle class jobs in America, and it turned out to be, I think the idea of it being sold as a one-way street or all upside no downside really came back to haunt, I think, the Democratic people, not to Democratic Party, not to say that the Republicans have um, no fault at all in that, but it was done under a Democratic president, and I think that um, the point that they don't really ever explicitly make is in this book, if you view from an economic perspective both the Democrats and the Republicans to be the same, and you're voting simply on, they make this point explicitly towards the end, is basically if you're only voting on cultural issues, the positions of Democrats tend to be the extreme positions of Democrats, with some few exceptions, are maybe less popular with the populace as a whole than many of the positions that the Republicans hold. And so that's a point they make towards the end as far as the average or median voter. Um, so I thought that was an interesting point. What else is there to say about this book? In the prose, um, yeah, I thought it was just really good. It did a really good job. It was really interesting to me to learn about those things. If you're someone who's a centrist, you're going to find a lot to like here. If you're someone who tends to identify as someone who is a Democrat and wants to hear this argument, you've probably heard variations of this argument many, many times before. So I don't know how much of it is new here. Some of the other things that they take the Clintons to task for is really um, the Hillary Clinton campaign, and where they feel that Hillary Clinton didn't really focus whatsoever on policy to her detriment. And I think that there was a sense of her taking for granted the Hispanic vote, and that's one of the points in the book. The book does make a few times is that the Hispanic vote has actually, especially working class Hispanics and Asians and Black Americans have not to not to the same degree that white Americans have done, but have drifted towards the Republican Party in the last few years. And it is a question of, well, why is that? And they come to the conclusion that there are the Democrats have taken the more professional, white collar, uh, cosmopolitan, as you would, positions on a lot of these things, which is the second half of the book. And they kind of explain why that is. They don't really get into, from a cultural standpoint, why, you know, white collar workers would have a certain opinion on the environment versus a blue collar worker. And they don't really get too much into the like, I'll get that. I'll get to that in the cons of the book, but there's some things that are missing about this book. If you're looking for someone to come forward with a full-throated argument for the more extreme positions of the left wing of the Democratic Party, you're probably not going to find it in the book. And there were some glaring omissions that I found were kind of strange when I was reading this. So let's go into the cons. They do take the ACA to task under Obama for the rollout of the program and it being very complicated, and um, the inability for some people to lose their plans when that happened. They don't ever mention the Affordable Care Act, the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act in this, which I thought was an omission and a strange one at that, which was by all means, by all measures, the most unpopular part of that law. They don't mention that in any way. Um, they don't really explain the lack of benefit that that seemed to give to the Obama administration. They briefly talk about the lack of accountability for bankers, but they don't go into that section with any kind of great depth. I was a little surprised about that. Um, and they mostly give him credit for having kind of a moderate position on the environment, but they do kind of chide him for being invested in the aftermath of the Great Recession, of having very pro business stance in many places, and they tie that to his midterm losses. And none of that was necessarily false. It just, I think, is a matter of there may be a difference of opinion of why he lost in the midterm, that different people may quibble with. I was surprised, like I said, the ACA, they didn't bring up the individual mandate, which I thought was really strange. Overall, that's just an example of something that was kind of bothered me. Overall, there's some times in the book where that you feel that they make their points two or three times, and they early on in the book, especially, they love some statistics, and they see there are times where you maybe could cut out some of the statistics. There's also, to me, the transgendered section kind of went on and on and on, and then there was also with the transgendered section, I thought that they could have incorporated the chapter. I think is called Sex and Gender, but it's really just about transgendered issues. It doesn't really go into very much the issues of gender in terms of men and women and differences of opinion in that. And I thought that was maybe a lost opportunity. They also, I was surprised when they were talking about Biden and his appeal to working poor people. They don't really bring up the student loan forgiveness thing, which to me was bizarre given how much I feel that he's fought for that policy. I thought that was also an area where they could have gone into detail. But the book, from their perspective, is, and then they talk at certain times implicitly saying that the deficit and debt levels don't matter, that this is something that is essentially brought up by economists and can be ignored. And the only reason this is brought up is really for the interest of big business and people who are on Wall Street. And there's no real, if you were reading that, you can come away with the fact that the belief that there's really no cost, quote unquote, to raising the debt levels to, 1.5, 2x the GDP. Economists would argue at that point. I even think like Piketty in his book of Capital in the 21st Century, and I'll leave links below to both those books, Capital in the 21st Century, and I'll also leave the David Leonhardt book um, links there. They he Capital in 21st Century, Thomas Piketty explicitly says, when you're getting around to 2x debt to GDP, historically speaking, it's kind of a red line that is some cause for concern. And we're not that far from 2x now. And so the idea that we could pump all this money into the system without problems, which they seem to imply, but then when they talk about uh, other things, okay, I'll get to it. This probably the biggest qualm to me. I think, depending on your political persuasion, there are some things in this book that you're going to take issue with. The biggest thing for me that I took issue with was the chapter on climate. I think they are very dismissive of the possibilities that climate are going to be much more egregious than they seem to think it is. They seem to say that realistically we can't get to by 2050 a zero carbon emissions or negative carbon emissions. I think that's actually debatable. We have the technology now to do it. We would just need the money and the will. The issue I have with it too is they acknowledge at one point that climate change is a problem. And their solution to it is to increase natural gas and to increase nuclear power. The problem with nuclear power is we've built, I think, I can count the number of nuclear power plants we've built in the last 30 years and have fingers left on my hands. And if I subtract the number of plants that we've actually decommissioned from that list, I'll have extra fingers. And so the cost of nuclear power is off the rails high. And yes, there's intermittency issues with sun and solar and wind. That's true. There are ways around that, which are to build greater transmission lines and things of that nature to have backups for when you need additional power. And maybe you can use nuclear as a third option for that, but there's ways to get around that I don't think they really considered in full. There's also, I would defer to Climate Future, which is a Robert Pindyck book that I reviewed in the past. I'll leave that link below as well. He comes to the exact opposite conclusion than to these two guys. These guys basically say, hey, we're going to essentially say that we'll let nature take its course, and whenever we get there, we get there. And there's not really a sense of urgency. And they're looking at it from a perspective of white or blue collar workers, and they feel that the blue collar workers, there's these jobs that are in danger because of um, the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and those are jobs like coal mining and working on derricks, which for a lot of people are really high paying jobs. The thing that they don't raise, and the thing that I think is important to note, is you're talking about, I believe, under 150,000 jobs. I mean, there's just not that many jobs that would qualify for oil and coal extraction. I think coal is under 100,000. I have to look up what the numbers are for people who work on oil rigs. So in the grand scheme of things, you're not talking about that many jobs. And every number that I've seen, you would increase the number of jobs beyond what we currently would subtract from those industries dying. Now, yes, are those jobs in general less paying than people who work on oil rigs and coal? Yeah, but there's going to be some level of people will have to move and retrain. That's going to be happen, and it happens all the time in every other industry that changes. And so, to me, the idea of, well, what we're going to do is we're going to not consider switching to renewable sources for 20 or 30 years because 100,000 people may be harmed in the process as opposed to millions of or billions of people in the future because we waited. That doesn't really seem like a solution to me. And again, MIT professor Robert Pindyck, in his book, the conclusion he comes to is we basically need to start now because the sooner we get to zero carbon emissions or negative carbon emissions, the more likely the total negative impact on climate change will be minimal. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And so the idea that we're just going to kind of run out the clock, he would say that that's the wrong path to take. So there's that part of it. Not to say that what they're talking about is unscientific. I think they're looking at it from a perspective of, hey, the amount of mobilization that you would need in order to get this done. They don't explicitly say why you can't do it, but they just seem to point to things like uh, the IPCC changing their worst case scenario kind of a little bit uh, to almost say, well, the absolute worst case scenario that people put out there as a possibility is slightly less likely to happen now than it was 20 years ago. But then in the same breath, they mention India and China, and you're like, well, when India and China come on board, do you think that China is building renewable energy to the same level they're building coal fire power plants? Well, no, most of what they have is coal fire power plants. And so if you give them a middle class lifestyle like most of us have here in the United States, the amount of energy you're going to need and the amount of coal that you're going to have to burn um, is just off the charts. And so you would really do have to take steps in order to lead in that if that's something you care about. So that's probably the biggest problem I had with the book. There wasn't anything in there that I thought was like factually inaccurate. It was more of like, well, you're not mentioning this part of it, and you're not mentioning this part of it. Excuse me. But if you're looking for something that basically says, I have voted, I'm a white collar, and I say this as someone who's a white collar worker. If you're a white collar worker and you don't know many people who consider themselves blue collar workers or working poor people, and you wanted to see a perspective of it that's not yours, these guys aren't blue collar workers either. But I think they at least examine the presidencies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and the failed campaign of Hillary Clinton through that lens. And I think the culture chapters, I think, give a pretty good explanation of how the average person sees those cultural issues. It may not be the way you see them, but to me, I thought they did a fair job of saying, well, this is how the average person sees them. The one I have apparently the biggest problem with is climate, and that may be because um, I've worked in renewable energy in the past, and it's something that is uh, very important to me, and I think about that stuff all the time. And I think they don't necessarily lie in the chapter or anything, but I think that the solutions they put forward to it don't live up to the actual problem that is climate change. And I think there's less of a full telling of how bad that can be and the cost that could happen to not only the United States, but everybody around the world if the idea is just like let nature take its course and we'll get there when we get there, which is kind of the purpose of a deadline is to force people to change their habits to get to where we need to get to. How realistic that is, well, you may have to. There's a book I've never read, but the title is, and I may read it someday for the channel. The title of the book is Demanding the Impossible, which is an oxymoron. It's about the history of anarchy. And the idea of demanding something that is impossible is a way of saying you have to change your mind of what you believe to be possible for in order for something to happen. And to me, it's a very similar thing. I've reviewed a long time ago. Reviewed We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer, and that book talks a little bit about the difficulties of explaining to people something that's beyond really their comprehension. And uh, it was frustrating in reading this and being and hearing kind of what I felt were kind of some short-sighted views of some of these things. But overall, if you're looking for someone to look at the presidencies of these guys through that lens, I thought it was a really interesting book. I would actually really recommend it if you have read the um, David Leonhardt book. Also read this. If you haven't read the David Leonhardt book, read this book instead, because I think it does a better job of. It's not unless you like the history part of it. If you don't like the history and don't need the history of it, this book does a very, very good job of really condensing the information that you need, having being written in a very, very straightforward way, and basically putting its arguments out there. And now there are people who would quibble and say, well, you're pulling the most extreme person and you're saying that this is the position of the party, but it's really just the one or two people in that party. And I think they do a good job. The authors do a good job of saying it's actually not the most extreme position because everybody who was running for president also signed on to this idea, or they also supported this, or they also supported that. And so I really enjoyed it for that. I think it puts people, it gives people who maybe hadn't thought about this before a really good introduction to these issues and lays them out in, I think, a very, very clear and easy to read way. Really enjoyed it. That was Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Next time I will be finishing Tim Powers and Anubis Gates. I'll leave all the links below that I mentioned. If you've enjoyed this video, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't before. And until next time, bye.